What bargain hath gold struck with mercy, that a lord may fling away a life like refuse upon the wind? Listen, the rain lays its palm upon the cobbles. A coach lamp gutters. A colt, young as a promise yet marred by a fight, stands like a question at a gentleman's feet. The millionaire, with silk and scorn embroidered upon his sleeve, lifts his hand and points not toward shelter but toward the ditch. Men laugh. Leather cracks. The colt's breath becomes a bell in the dark. Behold the image. Wealth bestriding want, a filth-streaked foal trembling beneath a jeweled boot. Smell the copper of blood in the sour of abandonment. Hear hoof shivers against stone. Count the breaths that fall between a life thrown away and a life saved. Who among the watchers will answer the small sound the colt makes? Neither neigh nor cry, but something older, as if memory itself were speaking, and there, amid the laughter and the lamps, someone moves and the air flinches. A retired officer with a silver whistle at his throat, harboring grief like a tucked wound. He sees the colt not as chattel but as a mirror. He sees in that scar the shape of something he lost. He hears a name that was not called aloud these many winters. What will that whistle awaken? What secret lies folded beneath the colt's silent eyes? The night holds its breath and the question hangs. What will the colt do next that shall leave a man of law and rank in such astonishment? Captain Elias Marlowe had grown accustomed to the strict music of absence. Once drums and orders braided his mornings. Once the thud of hooves had been the language of his life. Now he rose to the quieter sounds, ink upon paper, the slow tick of a clock, the hush of curtains where laughter had been. Wealth had followed his sabbatical from battle like a patient shadow, land enough to make men bow, silver enough to buy smiles. Yet neither acres nor coin could stitch shut the place in him where a name hung missing. He kept a bridle hung within his study, polished though unused. He kept a single boot by the fire. Never matched, for the habit of waiting is a stubborn thing. Men called it eccentricity. The poor called it mercy preserved in gold. For Elias loved order, and grief had taught him how to make law of his days. His title, captain, was a map of memory. He had been an officer in campaigns that sharpened silence into armor. He had returned with ribbons upon his breast and with one less voice at table. His boy, taken by fever in a winter when the sea would not give way. The wound he bore he did not name. It was the sort of hurt that learned to serve itself in small rituals. Feeding the dowager mare at the edge of his estate, mending a frayed harness with fingers that had once steadied others beneath cannon smoke. The silver whistle, thin with a dull dent where some hand had struck it, lived upon his person as a relic and a tool. He blew it seldom. When he did, horses listened in their dreams. The town knew Sir Reginald Huxley by the glitter of his carriage and the neatness of his sin. He was a millionaire whose charities graced the newspapers and whose dinners supplied the gossip. He kept the world in sharp edges, a facade of largesse, and behind it accounts that counted for more than compassion. He ran his stables like he ran his houses, efficient, profitable, and untroubled by the squeal of conscience. His men were fewer than his appetites. His coin was a weight that silenced questions. To him, horses were ledger lines and blood a transaction. Yet there are debts that gold cannot cancel. Rumors reached Elias one damp evening that a colt had been discarded by the river, where Huxley's men made sport of cruelty. A storied beast, some whispered. A crippled prize, others muttered. Elias felt the pulse of an old obligation quicken. He dressed in a coat thick enough to take the reine's edge and took by habit his whistle. A small grief, coiled and private, unfolded in his chest like a letter left on a pillow. If one could not shelter what could be sheltered, what worth had the rest? The captain walked with steadied steps toward the sound of scorn. The world about him was autumnal and honest. Reeds bent like bowed heads. The river moved slow as a remembered prayer. Lamps blinked like tired eyes. Dogs tucked their tails against the chill. Men with travails in their gait and horses with halos of breath moved past one another. In this ordinary night the extraordinary would knock. The discarded colt, the millionaire's laughter, the officer's approach. Elias did not proclaim himself as savior. He had no vanity for the role. He had only the ability to see what others dressed as rubbish, and a memory that made him tender to small creatures that bore the marks of hard days. Yet he carried more than compassion. He carried a history of commands and obedience, of signals given and received, and a knowledge of horsecraft that made him the sort of man a horse might understand, before it understood any human. Before the encounter, objects were planted in the mind like seeds, details Elias would not forget and which the story would later call upon. There was the silver whistle against his throat. There was a small leather tag in his pocket, a relic of his boy. A scrap with a name stitched into it. There was in his memory the rhythmic comfort of a horse's flank beneath his hand. Opposite him in rumor and lamplight stood the millionaire with his neat, cruel mouth and his men with coarse laughter. Between these two, the Colt would be the hinge. The Colt bore a scar across its shoulder, a thin crescent that was curious and old. It moved its ears with the caution of one who has learned that flesh is a fragile currency. The world inhaled, ready to see whether coin or conscience would direct the night. When Elias reached the lane by the quay, he found not only the Colt but the manner of its abandonment. A small cart overturned, splinters tasting river mud, men with boots like punctuation marks, and Sir Reginald Huxley in a cloak that refused the rain. The Colt stood a little apart, neck arched as though listening for a bell that had not yet been rung. Its eyes were dark with the opacity of one who had been taught not to trust sound. A thin rope, crude and sharp, had once bound it and had cut a pale line beneath the mane. A tiny brand, no larger than a thumb, marked its flank, half hidden by the fur. Elias, coming nearer, smelled the iron tang and the old sweat of frightened knights. The millionaire spoke with a voice that made others lean forward for the story of generosity he intended. Foundling, he said, as a man might refer to broken furniture. Worthless, and a hazard to my stable's repute. Elias had learned the grammar of horses, the tilt of an ear, the reed of a nostril, the cadence of breathing that meant sleep or fear. He saw in the Colt's nostrils not only the present terror but a memory of discipline, of a bit that had been too tight, of hands that had not heeded a foal's gasp. He moved without announcement, and the world seemed to gather breath. A young man among Huxley's men lifted a heel and the Colt recoiled. A woman, drunk on the performance of cruelty, clapped and called for the Colt to be driven into the ditch. Elias's whistle rested against his tongue like an old command. "Take it," Huxley said, as though offering the captain a coin that might flatter his conscience. "A beast lost on the road to nowhere. Keep it if thou wouldst fancy rebuilding thy fantasies." Elias looked at the Colt. He did not bargain. He took the rope from the young man's hand with fingers gentle as policy. The Colt shrank, a flinch of body that carries centuries of broken promise. He coaxed, not with speech but with the learned pressure of a palm at the right place. Behind the jaw, under the chin, that small region where trust begins in the horse. The animal sniffed his skin, tasting salt and the faint tobacco of his pipe. No barnyard, no show. Elias felt the Colt's muscles twitch beneath his palm, felt the memory of battle and barn and boots press against his own old marrow. They walked. The millionaire's laugh chased them like sleet. Men called after them that the captain had wasted his money upon a cursed creature. Yet as Elias led the Colt away, that small brand glinted under its hair, a mark that tugged at the edge of a memory. It matched in pattern a brand Elias had seen once upon a bay horse that had died under him in a thunderbolt of battle. The image arrived like a struck bell. A mare called Mercy, a scar upon her flank, the boy's small hand upon her neck. Elias stopped, breath flayed by sudden recognition. Had this then been bred from the line of something he had loved? Had fate shaped her seed into this muddy Colt and thrown it at his feet as if to test him? He took the animal home beneath a rain that seemed less unkind than the men who had driven it to the ditch. In the stable he warmed broth and set a straw bed. The Colt would not drink. It trembled as if some small cunning had taught it to fear kindness. At first touch it recoiled. It flicked its tail like a judge shaking off the petition of a poor man. Elias persisted. He sang, not words but the cadenced softness that horses know across language, and placed upon its lip the edge of broth until the creature tasted mercy and took it, shaky, as if learning a new grammar. Night after night the Colt resisted, ears pinned, eyes like midnight coins. It would nip at his sleeve with a caution so precise that even Elias felt the memory of an old reprimand. The townsfolk whispered. The captain had taken upon himself a beast more temperamental than a nobleman's poor reputation. Yet in the small hours there were shifts. The Colt would stand and watch the captain as he tended his small wounds, cleaning a scar upon the animal's shoulder, with the slow ceremony of a man attending to a loved thing. There was a moment, a tiny, defiant inch, when the Colt let Elias's hand remain upon its flank a second longer than fear allowed. Elias thought he heard, as when one listens to wind in a chapel, the faint echo of a name. He kept the silver whistle nearer, but trouble ripened like a storm. Sir Reginald did not forget the loss of a beast. In his ledger, the colt was but a line. In his pride, an affront. He sent emissaries who spoke of ownership, of bills unpaid, of stables lawed to his interest. They came with paper stamped by his hand, a paper that insisted the colt was his to reclaim. Elias, with his coin and his quiet, argued that the colt had been discarded, that mercy and habit made ownership irrelevant when cruelty took precedence. The men countered with statutes and threats. Words began to harden into a net. The town constable, a man of rules and little tenderness, arrived with a summons that smelled of ink and interest. "Sir Reginald's claim," he said, presenting the paper like a verdict. "By law, this animal belongs to him." Elias felt the chill of a different sort of command. He thought of the bridle in his study and the small stitched name tag in his pocket, things planted early that might be needed. To him, the colt was not ledger line but living hope. He found himself, against his better habit of measured response, telling mere men that he would not return the creature. The constable's eyes hardened. A battle of civility, all the more dangerous because both parties had coin and right. Then, one night when rain hugged the panes and the stable smelled of hay and broth, the colt did a thing that would not be easily forgotten. It stood in the shadow near the manger, ears pricked as if sensing an approaching footfall beyond the wall. Elias watched it, heart a slow drumbeat, when the beast lowered its head and, without rebuke, without fanfare, pressed its muzzle against his sleeve. The touch was small, domestic, and yet it carried a thunderous tenderness. Elias felt a rush, like a tide returning something left in the sand. The colt did not merely seek food. It offered a trust that was not owed. In that gesture, the captain felt the long seam of his private grief begin to stitch. He whispered a name he had not voiced aloud these many years. He whispered in the cadence of command and affection alike. And the colt answered with a soft, almost human sigh. This breach of the colt's hardness was also a crossing of a line. Word reached Sir Reginald. A man of rank had taken the animal, sentiments cheapened by its sentiment. Huxley decided that the colt's return must be more than legal. It must be public, a lesson to those who would presume sentiment over commerce. He arranged for men at dawn to come with ropes and with the swagger of proprietors, prepared to seize what he claimed as property. Elias woke to the distant clatter of boots and the low murmur of men speaking law as if it were a weapon. He clutched the silver whistle and opened the stable door to find that the colt stood in the threshold, nostrils flared, as though in anticipation. Outside, the millionaire's carriage drew like a storm. Elias stepped forward, the whistle cold at his lips. He thought of the brand upon the colt's flank, of mercy, of his lost son's laugh echoing among dry hay. He thought, too, of what might be proven, if patterns matched, if names aligned, if the brand were a key. He reached, with hands that had steadied men in battle, to lift a cloth from a trunk in the stable corner. Beneath lay a scrap of faded cloth, a stitch of a name, the trace of a locket once lost. The colt, sensing a change as sensitive beasts do, flicked its tail and stamped. Then, in a sudden, shattering motion, it turned and sprinted not away from Elias, but toward the stable wall where a loose board, forgotten and half-eaten by rot, gave a hollow sound beneath the hoof. With a surge of brute animal curiosity, the colt pawed at the board. Elias, half to stop it and half because a shadow of suspicion had grown teeth in his chest, knelt to pry the wood away. Beneath the rotten slat, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a leather-bound ledger and a scrap of paper stamped with Sir Reginald's crest. The captain's fingers trembled as he opened the book. Names ran along the page, men and horses and some. Transactions recorded with the neat cruelty of accounting, shipments of animals, destinations veiled as supplies, charges tallied against unnamed buyers. Beside a date he found in a hurried hand, a note. Bay mare, scarred, died en route, offered as replacement. The ink bled like a confession. Elias's breath fell through him as if a bell had tolled for some private funerary rite. The ledger told a story that matched the colt's brand and the dead mare's scar. It suggested trafficking, a commerce of beasts disguised behind respectable charity. Horses taken from fields, shipped in darkness, their fates traded like cheap cloth. The captain's hands, steadied in battle, shook not with fear now but with the cold of recognition. The colt, as though understanding, pressed its head into Elias's palm with the insistence of one who knows its own lineage and has chosen the hand that will see it. Outside, the carriage wheels stilled. Voices hardened. Boots approached with a law that smelled of ink and Huxley's clenched teeth. Within the stable, the ledger lay open between the man who had once commanded and a creature that had been rejected by a millionaire's ledger. The question that had begun as a whisper in the rain thundered now into proof. Had the millionaire cast away something that was linked to a history Elias once loved? Had cruelty hidden behind charity? And was the Colt the living key to that hidden ledger? A shout at the stable door split the air. Sir Reginald's voice like a dropped gauntlet. Men's hands gripped ropes. The constable lifted his document as if it were a sword. Elias stood, the silver whistle like a small, stubborn truth at his throat. The Colt, with one sudden, deliberate motion, stamped, turned, and placed its head beneath Elias's hand. Then, as though called by a fate that had been waiting, it blew out breath, and from its flank, beneath the pale crescent scar, gleamed a tiny metal tag, an insignia the captain recognized with a horror that froze his blood. The tag bore a name that was both a promise and a wound. Sir Reginald pushed the stable door, and the light fell upon that tag, and upon the ledger, and upon the man who must choose whether to speak the word that would both free and condemn. What will Elias reveal when law and ledger collide? Light fell like a judgment through the stable door, and painted the ledger's pages with the color of accusation. Sir Reginald Huxley's voice, which had so often made law of polite evenings, now made only the brittle sound of a man whose coin could not compass mercy. "This is theft," he cried, and men in his employ answered with shouts that had trained many to obey. The constable, fat with certainty, held his stamped paper as if it were a blade. Elias felt the room contract to the circumference of breath and proof and choice. He lifted the ledger as one might lift a relic. Careful, almost reverent, though the thing it revealed was ugly as bramble. The names of buyers, dates like a slow confession, payments for animals delivered to ports at odd hours, the terse line about the bay mare whose flank had been marred and whose life had been marked, died en route. The captain's throat moved. A man who had learned to give orders now needed the courage to speak truth aloud. "This book," he said, voice low as a bell, "is not mine to make light of. Yet it speaks plainly. It speaks of goods bartered and souls made cheap. It speaks of a mare I loved, Mercy, whose flank bore a moon of white and whose foal once warmed my son's hand." The stable breathed. Men shuffled. Rain tapped the roof like an impatient audience. Huxley's face did not betray the man beneath the name. He smiled thinly and named law with his mouth. "And yet, Captain Marlowe," he answered, "these pages were found hidden upon your ground. How shall the court say who hid what? Is it proof or planted paper?" His men laughed like a tide. The constable's eyes flickered. Bureaucracy prefers neat verdicts to messy truths. Elias could have yielded to the temptation of pride, torn the pages, handed the man the ledger to burn, and let the rot spread unseen. The battle in him, where once canon had been the law, now argued a more private command. Speak so that justice may find its tooth. He thought of the boy's small hand upon Mercy's shimmering neck. He thought of the whistle at his lips, of the stitched scrap in his pocket, the little tag that had never been lost from his breast, though all else had been taken from him. And then he did the irretrievable thing. He called the town to witness. "Behold," Elias said, "if law be blind, let it at least see the horse for what it is, living testament. See in this beast a mark the ledger names. See also what lies upon its neck." He let his fingers fall to the colt's mane and found, tangled amid hair and hay, a small leather thong from which dangled a locket. It was crude, worn by weather and time, yet when light kissed it something glinted inside. The colt had rubbed the locket into its mane. Perhaps the men had set it there as inventory. Perhaps a kinder hand had placed it in hope that someone might one day follow such a mark. The stable held its breath as Elias drew the locket free. He opened it. Within was paper faded to the color of old bread. One word remained in a child's hand. The ink had not quite drowned Thomas. The name struck Elias like a bell struck with a fist. He had not seen that handwriting in many winters, but he remembered the slope of the letters as one remembers a voice. The small scrap matched in the arc of its stitch, a scrap he kept in his own coat. The patch of cloth he had never dared wear because it carried the ghost of a laugh. He produced his scrap and the two sat side by side like twin ghosts. The boy's name again. The proof that Mercy's world and his had once touched. A gasp swept the cluster of men. Sir Reginald's color altered. For all his cloak and coin, he had never learned how to wear surprise. He moved like a man who believes his strengths to be beyond reproach and then finds a wind that turns them to paper. Fabrication, he spat. He said the word as though saying it multiple times might make it true. A trick! Then the Colt did something that no man in the room could have demanded, and which made every chest in the stable feel suddenly like it might split. It leaned forward and, in a motion too precise for simple fear and yet too fierce for falseness, placed its heavy muzzle against Elias's breast. The sound was small, a wet nudge, and yet it struck the captain as though a letter had been pressed against his ribs. The gesture was not trained applause. It was the old language of animals that know their kin by marrow and meaning. The creature's warm breath swept over his face. Its ears were forward, the pupils soft as if a private sun had risen inside them. Elias felt the deceit of years peel back from his eyes. He felt that the Colt, whose flank bore a brand like a memory and whose mane held a scrap as though by fate, had chosen him with an honesty that no coin could buy. He was not the only one moved. The constable's jaw slackened. Huxley's men looked to their master and saw in his hands not command but the shaking of a man who had been found naked. "You sold them," Elias said then, and the words came like a threshing. "You who speak of charity sold them to men who would consign life to ledger. You who call yourself a benefactor disguised your trade. This book names ports, and this token names my son, and this beast bears the scar Mercy gave her foal. Tell us now, how is it commerce to sell what breathes?" Huxley stepped back as if struck. For a moment the arrogance in him did not convert to cunning but to fear. He tried to close the wound with the old remedy, money. "There are sums large enough to hush any winter," he said, hands reaching for the coat he carried like a shield. "Pay me and the ledger will be buried. Pay me and the town will forget." His voice had the lilt of one who believes himself to be the sun, offering warmth for a price. Elias saw the thing for what it was, a test of whether coin or conscience ruled. He could, if he pleased, accept hush and return to rooms where grief sat politely in corner chairs. Or he could toss the hush away as a beggar's cup. Something in him, which the loss of his boy had hardened into a kind of righteousness, would not let him barter hurt for comfort. He set the ledger down upon the manger, and with a hand that had steadied men beneath cannon smoke, he told the constable to do his duty. "Take him," Elias said, "and take these papers. Let law, whatever its slowness, do what cruelty could not, for I will not be party to the silence of a town that counts souls as goods." The constable, having known only the slender power of signatures, found his spine where once he had lacked it. He seized the ledger, called for a carriage to escort the men, and read aloud the names which tied the port to the purchasers. Huxley's protests were furious and sharp, but the weight of evidence had teeth. Men with Huxley's coin fell away as if rumor were a fire that eats the weak first. The townsfolk, who had gathered at the edge of the courtyard with the hunger that only a scandal feeds, hurled questions. Huxley's men muttered. A few slipped their hands into pockets and found their conscience as empty as their patron's promises. Yet the climax needed not merely the law's slow hand, but a sign that would make the private wound public, proof that Mercy's line had not ended, that Thomas's name had been kept in a child's scrap, that a horse had the courage to choose a man of grief over a millionaire's ledger. The Colt, sensing the shift of authority and the loosening of fear, turned its head and, with a simplicity that made the crowd mute, trod forward and placed its entire forehead against the captain's mouth as if to be kissed. The contact, animal in its trust, human in its grief, was the sort of small, seismic moment that breaks a heart open and leaves truth exposed. Silence pressed, then broke into a sound like the sea brushing the shore. Men who had laughed the night before found themselves weeping. Neutrals who had watched party lines now saw only a child's name that no coin could coincide with. The constable, the ledger, the locket. These were not mere items, but the instruments of a public having its conscience called. Sir Reginald Huxley, for all his gilding, found himself carried away under the dignity of law and the indignation of the town. His carriage was a chariot of shame. His roads, once clear with favor, were ringed now with eyes that would record his passage differently. As men led him away, Huxley flung at Elias a last venomous thing. "You would play judge." He spat. Elias, who had been a judge in other ages and a father in another life, answered only with a look like a harvest, steady, inevitable. The colt stood between the man of law and the man who had been law's prey and breathed as if to close a chapter and open a door. Dawn's light came like a balm upon a town where whispers had been sharpened into truth. By morning, men brought forward names and ledgers of their own, little evidences of neglect, reports of animals purchased at night and spoken for by men who never answered next day. The constable, bolstered by public will, organized inquiries and ordered that Huxley's estates be opened to search. Old stables, once polished in secret, revealed their dark accounts. Some men fled, some found small mercy in confessing. The ledger Elias had found became, in a strange reversal, a tool for charity. Accounts turned to restitution, to the tracing of those animals whose lives had been sold beyond the sight of humane eyes. Elias worked with a care the war had not taught him. He walked within stables where the air smelled of hay and healing, making lists, taking names, speaking low to creatures who had been moved like furniture. The colt, no longer merely a curiosity but a companion, followed him like a shadow redeemed. It learned the cadence of his hands and the map of his presence. It lowered its muzzle when he scolded and warmed when he laughed. It was not immediate. Trust like muscle must be earned. Yet each morning brought a new small concession, a step closer to feed, a no longer jittery ear, a sleep that lasted more than a moment. Elias kept the silver whistle at his throat but used it now to call with gentleness. The sound became less a command than a balm. Townspeople watched and were taught by the sight of a man and a beast rebuilding in public. There were practicalities to address. Huxley's goods were impounded. Some men were fined and sentenced for trafficking, small punishments measured against the enormity of their deeds perhaps, but a start. Others, whose complicity had been more shadow than steel, found ways to redeem themselves. They gave up small sums to feed the rescued animals. They spoke in court against the older practices, and they learned that coin without conscience erodes to dust. The captain, who had once measured a man by the steadiness of his gait and the truth of his face, now measured him by whether he would return a horse to a field. Through it all, the colt remained an emblem, a living, breathing argument against the world that values what profits and forgets what loves. Children came to the stables to look upon the creature that had put a name into a town's mouth. They touched its flank and felt the crescent of its scar and learned from that small gesture a larger lesson, that things bear marks from suffering, and that remembering is the first service to mercy. Elias taught them not with preaching but with daily work, how to bandage, how to feed, how to stand still so that an animal might choose to approach. In those lessons, the captain found his wound knitting, slowly, honestly, without spectacle. The grief for his boy did not leave. It changed shape and became, instead of a choke, a river sustaining tender fields. There were nights when Elias thought of Huxley's last word, judge, and he wondered if he had been judge or merely a man whose private loss had propelled him into public duty. He did not seek the applause that followed. If anything, he shrank from it. He had feared that the ledger might implicate him, had feared that the stable's secret would be used to shame, yet the town's eyes had chosen to see mercy. He still wore his grief like a cloak, but it was less obliged to hide in silence. The colt's presence had taught him that to love after a loss is itself a defiance and a law. As weeks passed, other ledgers were found in outbuildings, and other small tokens, halters with names, a child's ribbon, even pamphlets that advertised discreet shipments came into light. Men who had once done cruel things in the shelter of profit now stood accused and in various measures accountable. The town's appetite for spectacle quieted into something steadier, repair. The rescued animals, when their wounds mended and their spines learned again to trust, were either rehomed or turned to fields where children might ride and not barter them as goods. The colt, growing in both body and in the estimation of men, became a symbol of a simpler contract, between hand and beast, between promise and keeping. Elias, for his part, began to speak more often. He spoke at meetings about the dignity of creatures under human care. He helped draft clearer rules for trades of animals and pressed the constable to be ever watchful. He did not, however, become an avenger. He bore no relish in Huxley's fall. Instead, he spoke of mercy as he had once spoken orders, not to command, but to care. And in those speeches, quiet as bread, his grief changed its grammar. It no longer read as a wound to be hidden, but as a scar that taught a town to mend. Months hence, the land moved as land always does. Seasons turn, grass grows, and men measure time by harvests and small acts of kindness. Elias walked with the colt, now sturdier, along the edge of a field where once a mare named Mercy had grazed. The animal's ears pricked to the wind. Its nostrils tasted the memory of hay. Children chased it in laughter. Farmers tipped their hats. The town had not become sanctified overnight, but it had learned to look upon ledgers with suspicion, and upon animals with better stewardship. And a quiet afternoon, Elias took the colt to a small mound, beneath a lone hawthorn where a stone leaned with simple words, carved so long ago that time had softened them into a kind of blessing. He knelt and touched the coolness of the stone and felt in the contact the weight of a name that had once been the center of his life. He had come because the colt had, in its simplicity, guided him, nose to hand, to this place. There, beneath the hawthorn, he set down the little leather scrap that matched the locket's paper, and the colt lowered its head as if to guard what men call memory. Elias spoke the name aloud, not as a command but as a benediction. Thomas. The word loosened a thing in him that had been held like an accusation. He told no crowd of how his son had loved Mercy, nor did he craft the moment into spectacle. He simply sat with the horse, felt the rhythm of its breathing match his own, and let the world be small and true. The colt, whose bravery had undone a millionaire's ledger, stood quiet as a promise kept. When Elias rose, he left a thin wreath of straw upon the stone and, turning, found that the animal had nudged the scrap of cloth into the hollow of his coat, an odd, faithful gesture, as if the beast wished always to be near the thing that had begun its salvation. In the seasons that followed, Elias taught a new generation the old arts: how to read a flank, how to tend a fever, how to name mercy when one sees it. He did so not to make himself famous, but to build a small continuity where the mistakes of past men might not find so ready a place to hide. The colt grew into a horse of quiet bearing. Men who had once seen only commerce learned again the economy of kindness. The town, when it told of that night by the quay, did so in the manner of myth and care, not to praise its heroes but to remind itself of the price of neglect. When at last Elias, older by seasons and softened by an honest sorrow, stood at the stable door and watched the horse lift its head toward the dawn, he found that his private landscape had changed. The scar upon the colt's shoulder, once a sign of cruelty, now shone like the crescent of a new covenant. The metal tag and the locket, small mundane things, rested in his drawer, not as trophies but as relics of a lesson learned, that what is cast away may in truth be a summons to the better angels that walk among men. The story closed not in triumph, but in a kind of gentle reckoning. Elias did not pretend that all wounds were healed. He knew the world's cruelty would never vanish, yet he had, in his small way, answered the question that began that rain-swept night: whether a man of rank who has loved and lost could find again the courage to give mercy to what is small. The horse's final act in that town was not the roar of vengeance, nor was it the blaze of a conversion sudden and blinding. It was instead a simple act of leading. One morning it nudged Elias's sleeve and walked between the captain and a field where children now ran free. In its steady steps there was a suggestion that some paths are mended not by force but by the soft persistence of presence. And so the last image rests upon a plain kindness. A man once armored by duty, now armored instead by memory, following a horse that had been cast away but chose to return. The creature's hooves pressed the earth in even measure. The hawthorn's shadow leaned. The town's gossip quieted into a language of care. There was, in that passing, a closure like a bell rung at evening, sounded not to end a tale but to bind its pieces into something that might hold. Thus mercy, found where riches cast away their refuse, led the wounded man back to himself, and in that steadfast grazing of a faithful brow did sorrow learn at last to be a garden. If thy soul was stirred, subscribe and ring yon bell, that thou mayst join us anon for tales untold.